Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Rosen Wartell, and I have the great honor of being the president of the Urban Institute and welcoming you to our broadcast today. I'm thrilled to be joined today to discuss the 2020 census with three really terrific experts on this. We'll be joined in a few minutes after I do a brief overview by my colleague Diana Elliott, who's a principal research associate at Urban. Her work focuses on families' financial security and economic mobility. Really lucky to have Arturo Vargas here. He's Chief Executive Officer of NALEO, which is the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, Education Fund, which is a national nonprofit that strengthens America's democracy by promoting the full participation of Latinos in civic life. Arturo is a real champion of the census and its import. And really lucky, especially today of all days, to have Tom Wolf here, Senior Counsel and Spitzer Fellow with the Brennan Center's Democracy Program, who can especially tell us what's going on in the courts right now on this matter. He focuses on the census and redistricting. Today's event is part of a series of discussions that Urban's been holding with leading changemakers and policy analysts on questions emerging from the COVID crisis and the long overdue reckoning with our nation's ongoing structural racism. First, a few housekeeping notes. We will record this event and it'll be available along with relevant links online afterwards at our website. All of the participants are muted, but you may put your questions or comments in the questions box. This is a very short event. We don't have a lot of time, but it really helps us, and I try to shape the discussion when I see what's on your mind, and it helps us shape what we do in the future. Finally, let me encourage you to join the conversation on social media. On Twitter, use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. So once every 10 years, the census attempts to gather a complete picture of America. The census affects federal funding allocations, redistricting, state and local budgets, and millions of data-driven business decisions. And it provides critical information central to many research efforts so that we better understand society and what works and what doesn't. Reliability, accuracy, public confidence in the census are paramount. And so a census miscount has real consequences. It exacerbates racial inequalities, diminishes a community's rightful political representation and voice, and it will unfairly provide access to resources and with them opportunity. Finally, it undermines knowledge and understanding that is important to us all. And to the extent those miscounts disadvantage communities of color, as they typically do, and other communities as well, the miscount is yet another system and structure that bakes discrimination into the very fabric of American society. In 2019, Urban published a feature that you can find online. We'll provide a link at the end that's called Who's at Risk of Being Miscounted? And there are a whole host of resources that'll be available on today's page at the end of the day. There have always been challenges fully counting all of those here in the US at a given period, and this census faced new challenges and opportunities to take advantage of technology to improve the count. Historically, census funding lagged what census officials needed, but as the date neared, Congress typically did a bit more. This cycle, the Census Bureau had long planned to use some new procedures and incorporate more technology. Some of the methods they tested proved not ready for prime time, and they've faced this year especially steep underfunding. Then the Trump administration sought to include a question on immigration status on the census, a move eventually blocked by the courts. And more voices are expressing concern about political interference with the professional execution by career staff of a complex technical undertaking in the best of times. So we began 2020, this year's census was going to be an extraordinarily fraught, difficult, and contentious one. And then along came a global pandemic, which disrupted years of planning and preparation for execution of the census and mobilization at the community level to help ensure that almost everyone is counted. In the early months of the impact of COVID became clear, the Census Bureau extended the count process to October 30th and delayed when it planned to report the enumeration until April in order to respond to this challenge and address the looming undercount issues. But then in August, in an unexplained reversal, the Bureau announced it would cut short their in-person counting efforts by a month and end them on September 30th. That's tomorrow. And plan to report the enumeration by the end of this year, before Inauguration Day. Just last week, the California District Court Judge, Lucy Coe, ruled that there seemed to be no basis for the reversal and re-extended the count to October 31. And then yesterday, there were reports that the Census Bureau nonetheless planned to cut off the count on October 5th while they appealed, apparently in defiance of the court's order. And today there was a new hearing, and we'll shortly hear, or I'm sorry, that hearing is at 6 o'clock today, but we'll shortly hear more about where things stand from one of our panelists. Unprecedented challenges, much confusion, really real consequences that could exacerbate racial inequalities and leave communities out of their share of political representation and funding, just to name a few. To help us unpack these issues, I'd love to turn to Diana, Arturo, and Tom. Can you guys join us, please? Thank you. And here they are by the magic of technology. All right, 3 for 3. So let me start with you, Diana. Can you just give us a super quick overview of what the key elements of the process are?
The key elements of the operational process, or sure, of the pandemic, or
no, but the key components of the process, the census count. So we all have the same vocabulary. Yeah,
absolutely. So the census for the first time this year went with an online option. So around mid-March, right when the national emergency happened, flyers went out. People got links to respond online. Some people got questionnaires. So that started the self-response process. Around mid-May, they were supposed to start in-person enumeration. That, because of the pandemic, got delayed until July. And so we're still trying to play catch up on that. And the field operations are still ongoing. And as you said, we don't know if this is ending on October 5th or on October 30th, but it looks like there are efforts right now to wind things down, unfortunately.
And just to clarify that after you do the self-response and after you do the in-person enumeration, that's not the end of the process. The Census Bureau has a number of additional steps, and then eventually they report to the president. 30 seconds on those additional steps.
All right, I'll go. Yeah, that's right. So there's data processing, and the data processing, you know, having worked at the Census Bureau, this is no small task, right? There's a lot of work behind the scenes to get the data right. One of the big hiccups this year is that we're going to have a lot of duplicates. We had a lot of people moving around during the pandemic and probably reporting in a couple different places. So that data is going to need to be straightened out. And there's just a lot of time that goes into making sure that the data are accurate behind the scenes. And then December 31st typically is when things are turned over for that apportionment piece. But this year we were supposed to have an extension till April. That was cut off. There looks like they're cutting the data processing time short, unfortunately.
And just one other key piece in that period of data collection or data sorting, the Census Bureau knows that they undercount people. And so they have processes in place to adjust the count to more accurately reflect society. That is one of the elements that takes time and effort.
Correct. There's procedures to use administrative records. So data, for example, from the IRS are often used to sort of understand what household compositions look like. There's also factors, ways to sort of estimate, you know, based on this household characteristic and this person over here, can we impute the data? Can we sort of say, you know, estimate what this household is likely to be based on some incomplete information?
Got it. Aim is to try to use those techniques to get to as accurate a count of who's really there as possible.
That's
so
right.
Tom, now fast forward to what's happening on the ground this moment. There's been litigation throughout this census count this year. The most recent litigation is about this issue Diana mentioned of how long does the Bureau have to do this effort to get the data right based on the self-reporting and the collecting. And then also how long does the Census Bureau have to report those numbers to the president for the enumeration of the population? What's the issues at stake?
Thanks, Sarah and Diana. I think they've done a good job laying out a lot of the predicates, so I might be able to speed through what I would say otherwise. But you know, the gist of it is that back in April, the administration released what we were calling the COVID plan, which stretched out all of the operational benchmarks in the processes to give the Bureau more time to get everyone counted, under the basic intuition that the pandemic was going to mean that the Bureau needed more time rather than less. We spent about 4 months of time that the Bureau could have been using, theoretically at least, to count people, and they instead were on more or less a pause. Then right when they were about to ramp up the door knocking process in August, on August 3rd, abruptly and without explanation, they issued a press release saying that instead they were going to stop the count by September 30th rather than Halloween, as everyone in the country had then been told. That raises a variety of issues, two of which we've presented in our case. One is the Administrative Procedure Act, which, there's a tendency, I think, particularly in law school for law professors to teach the Administrative Procedure Act in a way that makes it seem like it's about sort of dry technical details. But what it's ultimately about is the basic notion that Congress gives a lot of power to agencies. And if agencies are going to act, they have to do so in ways that are transparent and reasonable and in the public interest. So the gist of our APA claim is that they reversed at the last minute without giving any good reasons, and particularly after having spent months where leading Census Bureau officials themselves said it would be impossible to wrap up the count earlier. We also have an enumeration clause claim. It's a constitutional claim. The basic idea there is that the government, according to Supreme Court precedent, has to make reasonable attempts to count everyone. And a process like this, where you reverse at the last minute in the face of a pandemic, can't possibly be constitutionally sufficient. So we sued on August 18th. We found out in early September that the Bureau was already planning to shut down ahead of September 30th. So we got what's called a TRO, a temporary restraining order, that stretched the period for counting out a little bit more. Then we got a preliminary injunction on September 24th. Basically what the preliminary injunction does is the following. It blocks the Bureau from stopping counting on September 30th, and it blocks them from reporting data to the president for apportionment by December 31st. The way the law works in this area is that the last legally valid plan becomes the controlling plan again. So they should be back on the COVID plan, which is counting until Halloween and then releasing the data for apportionment in late April. Now, that immediately led to an appeal. We have an appeal that we're defending now in the Ninth Circuit. There are a couple layers, it's complicated, I won't really bore people with the details, but the basic idea is the government's trying to dissolve this preliminary injunction we have before the case is ultimately resolved so that they can wind the census down on the schedule that they would prefer. Now, there's also stuff going on at the district court level, which is not always common. What provoked this was about 2 minutes before our hearing last night to talk about compliance with the judge's order, the Census Bureau issued the tweet saying that they were going to shut down. They had a target date for shutting down on October 5th. So,
and clear, that's October 5th. The judge had told them not to shut down till the 30th, and despite that, they announced October 5th.
They announced October 5th as their wind down date, which means that we're going to be back in court tonight to talk more about what that ultimately means. We were able, through the court order, to obtain the documents that the government says underlie the decision now to move to October 5th. But yeah, we'll be in court in about an hour and 15 minutes to talk about that a little bit more, what that means for the case and what we'd like the judge to do. We haven't yet put our filing in on that, so I can't fully say what we're about to say, but at 6 o'clock, everyone can tune in and watch on Zoom.
So, Arturo, I'm going to ask you two key questions. The first is, this was an unprecedentedly controversial census count before because of some practices. So I think it's really important for you to set some context. And then we've just heard a lot about the procedure and the dates and all that. What's this really about? Why are they trying to complete as quickly as possible? And what's the larger sort of end game that's really at stake here?
Right. Well, thank you for those two really important questions. First, the context is that this administration has been interfering with the 2020 census since it first was able to turn its attention to it. And that included trying to add a citizenship question. It included meddling into the plans that the career professionals have put in place to carry out the census. And then once the pandemic hit, not allowing the professionals to do what they needed to do in terms of backup plans in order to try to salvage the census. So we get to your second question, why? Why is this administration rushing the census, forcing the Census Bureau to cut corners and not do the best count possible? The only reason that we can, or conclusion we can come to, is that this president wants to be sure he has control over the numbers that will be used to apportion the House of Representatives, which means he wants the apportionment numbers delivered to him by December 31st of this year while he is still in office, so that he can, according to the executive memorandum he issued, remove certain people from state counts to change the apportionment of the House of Representatives according to a second set of number that he would come up with. This is about playing with our Constitution and trying to undermine the census in a way to partisan political advantage.
So I'm going to ask both you and Tom just to explain that point a little bit. There is a legal question, Tom, if you start. The tradition has been that the census has counted all of the people in the United States. The administration has a theory, I believe, that suggests that it should only count some of the people who are here if the others are not here as documented citizens. And so the original question they wanted to add to the census was simply an information collection in order to identify who was here, who was participating in the census, who was not documented. The court said to them they couldn't do that.
Actually, it was a citizenship question. It wasn't an immigration status question.
I'm sorry, correct, thank you. So help me understand, what is it that there's now this effort to adjust the numbers in some way that would be done through administrative procedure? What is ultimately the underlying theory that is being prosecuted here, as far as we can tell? It's never been fully explained. Tom, do you want to start, and then I'll go back to you, Arturo?
Sure. Well, I think that the kind of highest level picture here is that if we're talking about Donald Trump's theory about what should happen with the apportionment count, we basically have to assume that the Trump administration has divined some sort of new constitutional principle that no one in the history of the country ever had discovered before. As Sarah noted, the Constitution's command is clear. Everyone is counted. This has been the tradition for hundreds of years now. The statutory controls on who counts reflect that constitutional commitment. And there was a 3-judge panel in New York that was sort of first to move in a series of cases that have been brought challenging the president's memorandum that reached the same conclusion. And in fact, what that panel said was that the merits of this question were not even clear. The merits of the question were not hard.
Yes.
That's a big difference between the two. Because the constitutional meaning is clear, but they actually ruled on statutory grounds, and on statutory grounds, the meaning is quite clear too. It's created this sort of strange dynamic where everything about the census process is getting sort of morphed and manipulated in order to help the president enact something that he'll never actually be able to do, either practically or legally. And so we're sacrificing the accuracy of a $15 billion, more than a decade effort to count everyone for the sake of something that's never actually going to happen and never could happen.
So what's the underlying end game here? What is the strategy that all of these legal maneuvering is about? Is there this question about why does someone want to affect who gets counted? To ask the most basic question.
Let's not forget that the census is the foundation of our democracy. And the two principal purposes of the census today are to reapportion political power to the people according to how many people live in each state. And by that political power, I mean seats in Congress to each state. And also to distribute $1.5 trillion in federal resources every year to the states for everything that the federal government does. We're talking Medicare, Medicaid, school lunch programs, Head Start, railroad construction, highway infrastructure. All of this depends on census data. So if you're not counted in the census, or certain people are not counted in the census, the communities where those people live will not get their fair share of political representation or resources. The census is about power and money. Who has it, who keeps it, who's denied it, based on whether or not someone is counted in the census.
Great, thank you. So Diane, I want to ask you two questions, and maybe if you can take them both at the same time. So the first, we have a bunch of questions here. In this process in which the census goes and after they collect the actual self-reporting, they do the enumeration, they're now telling the public that they have now 98% of the households have been counted as of today. That's their, the public line. So can you tell us a little bit about what that actually represents? How are 98% counted? And then I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the way in which the pandemic has affected the mechanisms by which counting has happened. You're
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure thing. So yeah, so this 98, 99%, that's sort of, it's really more about coverage but not really about who's reported. So I think it's really important to kind of peel back the layers and think a little bit about what those numbers compose. And we know that certain groups are counted a bit more than others, and certain groups are counted, undercounted relative to others. So as Arturo was saying, communities of color tend to be undercounted. And that's where we're gonna, that's where in-person enumeration really, really matters. The self-response rate is actually what I look at the most because that's the most accurate, frankly. And we know that white, affluent, suburban, older homeowners are more likely to self-respond. Those numbers are more accurate. They're the people who respond earliest. Consequently, building off of what Arturo said, that means that those communities, if those counts are more accurate, get more of the funding than communities where there are undercounts. And that has real ramifications over time. So in terms of, like how the pandemic has affected this, I think this was question 2, is that right, mm-hmm. of your questions? So this has only exacerbated the issues with self-response and non-response because the pandemic hit in a way that, made it easier, frankly, for the groups who are always going to respond by online to count themselves and or double count themselves. I really want to stress that. People in New York City who left New York City might have counted themselves in their apartment in New York and might have counted themselves at a second home, right? That's a real problem in the census as well. So that's sort of one factor, is that operations just went into a tailspin because the pandemic happened right at the same time. I think the other thing to consider here is that, again, it gets back to this, who gets counted piece. If we have this situation where people in communities that, let's take young children are undercounted at higher rates than other groups. If young children are missed in certain communities of color, let's say in the middle of DC versus affluent suburbs, then we have a situation where it's not just this year, it's the next 10 years where those kids miss out on funding and their communities miss out on funding. So the pandemic only exacerbated all of these issues and will in effect suppress the count of some groups and will encourage the count of other groups where we don't necessarily need double counts.
So Arturo, I just wanted to ask you to unpack a little bit more about the mechanisms here. So the self-reporting happens, mm-hmm. certain groups do a better job than others. That usually gets us to about 58% of the population, maybe if we trust the numbers. Mm-hmm. But then the second part, the in-person enumeration, is designed to get at the populations in particular that don't self-report. And that typically it involves fairs and going to the places where people gather. It involves going to the dormitories and assisted living facilities and the places where large groups gather and maybe a single landlord, a college dorm, et cetera, might report. There's a whole set of strategies that both people wanting to make sure their populations are counted are doing privately and which the government is doing. And those involve in-persons. How's that been interrupted by COVID? And right. Is there anything we can do about it at this point?
Well, at this point, the most we could do about it is continue to encourage people to fill out their census forms online by whatever deadline we end up with, October 5th, October 31st, just do it. But see, that's the thing. People have been in their homes now, unless they're essential workers, and many Latinos were essential workers and forced to work during this pandemic, but many people were in their homes for months and still did not respond to the census. So there was something else going on here that wasn't happening 10 years ago. You know, think about having to count all the fruit on a tree. Self-response is all the low-hanging fruit, the fruit that's the easiest to count. Well, you're not going to get 100% count until you count the fruit that's the hardest to reach. That's the most difficult to count because it's that way at the top, out of sight, out of mind. That's non-response follow-up. That's where the Census Bureau goes out and tries to knock on the doors of the people who never responded to get information. Then there's the fruit that fell, that was never on the tree to begin with. That's your service-based enumeration, your homeless count, the people who don't live in traditional housing. You have to count all the fruit. But what the Census Bureau has been doing, especially in the census, is only getting the low-hanging fruit, telling us it's reaching 99% when we know that there are many households, many Americans are going uncounted in the 2020 census.
And so, Tom, I wanted to ask you also about these sort of issues of who's getting counted, and maybe both of you to this go back to the context again. Are there reasons in this moment where we think people who might have participated 10 years earlier may be choosing not to participate in the census right now, she says with a loaded question. And why might that be, that folks are choosing not to participate? Is there anything we can do about that context now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this goes back to some of the things that we talked about earlier in terms of major headwinds against the census. So I'm a lawyer. When I started getting involved in the census space, it was primarily to respond to people's concerns about confidentiality. One of the long-running concerns has been that if people supply their data to the government for census purposes, the government's going to turn around and use it for things like law enforcement or immigration enforcement, or maybe they give it to your landlord and your landlord evicts you because you have too many people in the apartment. All things of that nature. There's serious concerns, but because people historically have been concerned about those things, there are laws to protect against that happening. Now, the citizenship question, particularly in the hands of a xenophobic administration, takes those pre-existing concerns and drives them through the roof. And so the citizenship question forced a lot of people to have to do a lot of work, not only to block the question, but to tamp down concerns that their data was going to be used against them. When you end up in a situation like this now, where the president has announced that they're going to collect, that they're using data from other sources, that other records they've collected to try to cut undocumented people out of the count, it starts to connect with those concerns again, that maybe it's pointless to participate in the census. So one way or another, you get suppression. When you keep changing the deadlines, that also creates situations where you can suppress the count because the people that are hardest to reach are the people that we're trying to reach in October. And that's ultimately what the lawsuit is about. That's what the push at the congressional level to extend the timelines is about. All of this is about buying time so that the Bureau can actually do what it already told everyone they need it to do to count everyone in the country. NARFU, the door knocking process, in the Bureau's own words and documents that have been on its website for years, is quote unquote all about the hard to count populations. Hard to count populations include folks who the Bureau would identify as Black, Hispanic, and Native American on reservation, in addition to a variety of other groups. So when you cut NARFU short, you're cutting short the process that is sort of quintessentially the census and is designed to make sure that we actually have the inclusive population count that the Constitution contemplates. So this isn't really just about calendar dates. The calendar dates matter because they're ultimately how we count everyone.
And Diana, I remember that you and your colleagues did some work last year to look at how the debate about the citizenship question being on the census was affecting attitudes from people even before the census started. Could you do quick on what you found there?
Yeah, well, there was pretty good documentation from the Census Bureau itself flagging even before the citizenship question became an issue. that people were increasingly nervous about participating in routine census activities. So there was a suggestion, even before the citizenship question, that there was a chill among people who had typically been sympathetic. And we know that that distrust of government is a big motivating factor why people don't want to answer the census. So when you layer in a pandemic where people are coming around door knocking during a pandemic, I think it just sort of elevates, and during this climate, as Tom said, where there's a political climate that's not friendly, why would you open your door and answer the census?
We have a question from the group particularly about the count for indigenous groups. And there seems to be a lot of confusion about whether the tribal populations are being asked to indicate what tribe they're a member of in order for representation to be seen. What are we worrying about, particularly about how effectively tribal populations are going to be counted in this area? Is that something, Arturo, you can speak to?
Well, excuse me, we know historically that Native Americans living on American Indian reservations have had the worst counts and the most undercounted populations of any other ethnic or racial group. The pandemic has made it even more difficult for the Census Bureau to have access to reservations in order to count people on those lands. Now, in terms of self-identification, the census form does allow somebody who identifies as an indigenous person to indicate what tribe they're from, but they don't have to write that tribal name. But we do want to make sure that everybody who identifies as Native American is able to do so on the race question. But the problem that we're having here is that the Census Bureau from the get-go was behind the eight ball, in terms of counting indigenous populations, even before the pandemic hit, because of its lack of resources to be able to go into rural areas and knowing exactly how the process is going to work in rural areas because of lack of proper testing in rural areas before the census even started. So we have a great reason to be worried about an undercount of the Native American population, especially this time around.
All right, so we're going to close this out with a speed round. I want to ask everyone to talk a little bit about what happens next and what could be done. And then, Tom, we're going to get you to give everybody a quick promo for how they can find the hearing tonight for those who want to follow along. But specifically, whenever the count is done, and whenever there will then be a question of how do we use the information in the count, and whether we get the best support from the courts, that Tom and others I'm sure could hope for, or whether the count ends soon and is enumerated during this term for the president. Either way, we know the count is not going to reach everyone. Why don't you start, Arturo, and I'll ask Diana, and then Tom, if you could close us out with sort of the litigation prospects. What do we do next to try to deal with the fact that we know there will be some populations who will not be reflected as well in the census? Arturo?
Well, I think there's something that Congress needs to do next. What Congress needs to do is restore certainty to what is happening right now. We don't know what the end dates are for counting the population. Congress should take a leadership role, the leadership role given to it by the Constitution as being responsible for the census, and change the statutory deadlines for the delivery of the data for apportionment and redistricting, as has been requested by the administration originally, so that there is certainty at the Census Bureau that it can complete its work and do the best job possible.
Diana, what can anyone do?
Well, I'd like to see more time for the good people at the Census Bureau to be able to do their work behind the scenes and in a non-political environment. I think that's really key. The data should not be politicized, and they should have the time necessary to make sure things are accurate. I think the other thing that we can think about as a next step is how can we can't do anything about the census counts in terms of apportionment, but there could be strategies for thinking about making accommodations for the data in terms of funding. And I think that's where I think some creativity and some real leadership could come into play in terms of thinking about different strategies for using the data for thinking about funding allocations.
So just to make sure people understand the implications, if Congress designs a funding formula that would have traditionally been based on census counts, they could, in the design of the formula, make some, suggest ways in which the agencies could adjust it for other estimates, for example.
I think there are strategies there, yeah.
Okay. So Tom, your thoughts on what next, and then can you wrap it up by telling us what's ahead in the litigation?
Sure. My main suggestion is going to reflect what we've already heard from other two panelists, time. We need these timelines extended. The reason why we're fighting this in court so tooth and nail is that time does a lot to alter the prospects for there being a better count. It's always going to be easier to fix it on the front end than it will be on the back end. The other thing that I would add a pitch for that's slightly more obscure is making sure that the Bureau does a robust post-enumeration survey, which is the mechanism that over the last few decades they've used to ensure that they have some alternative population counts. And this has been sort of the benchmark that they've used to identify things like differential undercounts. I would hope that that does not get axed or is not done as fully and thoroughly as it should, because that's a tool that will be vital going forward.
And if people want to follow on the hearing and see what comes next?
Sure. So Judge Ko, who our case is in front of out in San Jose, conducts all of her hearings through Zoom, and anyone can tune in. You can only tune as a listener if you're not an attorney in the case, but you can hear and see everything that's going on. So Matt, I believe, shot a link through in the Q&A.
In the chat, I think.
Right. Yes, in the chat. And that's a uscourts.gov address. If you click on that at 6 o'clock, it will take you to the hearing.
All right. Well, stay tuned, everyone. This is clearly, at other times in our history, this issue would have been capturing so much attention. I think that we are at one of the most, between the pandemic and the election, this is an incredibly fraught moment in our society, and it's hard to always break through, but this really matters. So I'm enormously grateful to all three of our speakers today. Thank you, Arturo, Tom, Diana, for your work. Thank you for being with us, and thank you, friends, for joining us. Tune in next time for more information at Evidence to Action. Be well and look for the links. We'll send it out to all participants. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.